Thanks, Danielle, for introducing. I haven't got used to Zoom doing that yet. Yeah, brilliant. So just as a really quick introduction, I think a lot of the people who have joined us we've seen before, so welcome. Thank you for coming to another one of our things. It's really great to see you again. But if you are new or new to Red Letter Christians, I'll give a really brief introduction to us. So we're a dispersed network of people, churches and organisations that believe that living for Jesus means living for justice. We're here to support each other, challenge injustice, and hopefully bear witness to God's love at work in our communities. Our hope for events like this is that we're inspired and challenged to love better and more fully. So we're really excited to have Jarel with us this morning. I will introduce him properly in a second, but yeah, just as Danielle said, we do try and make these sessions as interactive as possible. So we'll have a little bit of an introduction from Jarel, and then we'll have a number of opportunities to discuss themes that have been lifted from the book. We've gone through all the rules of engagement, but essentially we'll all be kind to each other and everything will be all right. And yeah, so it's really, we're really excited to have Jarel with us this morning. He's the Assistant Curate of St Boleslas without Aldgate in the Diocese of London in the Church of England. He served as the Associate Chaplain at King's College London, and he is the Vice Chair of One Body, One Faith. His research focuses on bodies, ethnicity and desire in late antique Egypt, and his most recent book, which we're discussing today, addresses Black queer bodies and grace. But I'd love Jarel to give a little bit more of an introduction to himself and the book and what shared him to write this and share it with us.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you to everyone who's here this morning. It's really lovely to be able to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. It's felt like a long time coming, so now that we're finally able to do it, I'm really glad that it's happening. And thank you to all those who've kind of bought this book and read it. It's really bizarre, I think. If there are any other writers in the room, you'll know what I mean. To go from this place where you have a kind of project in your mind, and you're like working away at it on your own, and then suddenly it's in people's hands and people are commenting on it. It's quite a weird part of the process to come to this point, but I really value the fact that people have engaged with it. In terms of who I am, I mean, introductions to kind of me, it's always difficult to know what is interesting or important, but I suppose one of the really important things to talk about is how I came to have faith in the first place, and where that began. And I think the origins of my own faith story definitely begin with my grandmother. So I was raised by her, and she came from Jamaica just after the Windrush generation. And she was a very, very dedicated Methodist in church every Sunday. My sister and I were brought up by her because our mother has very poor mental health and is often in hospital, and Dad wasn't really on the scene. So my nan took both of us in. And we weren't forced to go to church, but the kind of Christian thing rubbed off because that was part of the pattern of life at Nan's house, that her and Granddad went to church and that was just what they did. And so we did often. And Sunday was a kind of hallowed day. I wrote about this in the book, actually, how Sundays had a particular shape to them and a feeling that that one day was a family day. And I think there was just something about being in church often and having really good ministers that did impact me. You know, I remember growing up hearing very good preachers and receiving amazing pastoral care from the ministers that we had. And I'm sure that in my mind, even as a child, I thought, well, there's something in this because I'm seeing it work for some people. And it wasn't until I got older and had a more critical kind of lens about things and realized who I was truly that I began to realize the tensions between faith and my own identity. And that was much later, probably around the age of 15. So I was working a lot of that out, I think. But also, I write a bit in the book about my Caribbean identity, which also comes through being raised by my grandparents. So Jamaica, the Caribbean, always felt much closer to me than it did or does to some of my younger cousins because of being brought up by my grandparents who were Jamaican. So actually the cultural thing weighs a lot heavier in my experience and in that of my sister than it does in some of my cousins. And both my sister and I have dual nationality, so we have Jamaican and British citizenship. So that shapes kind of who I am and my outlook, I think, not just in terms of sexuality, but also theologically, that I'm aware of what people call the kind of global church because I feel part of that. And I'm aware of the fact that there are theologians from all around the world because I have a connection to other parts of the world in a very deep way. And I'm also trying to think about the origins of the book. In some ways, they were very practical. So the very beginnings of this book were I gave a paper at the Society for the Study of Theology in 2018, I think it was. I had never been to an academic conference before, did not know what they were really about, had no idea what I was doing, and gave a paper on grace and queer Black bodies. I don't know who told me that was a good idea, because I had not consulted anyone on how to give a paper at a conference, but I did it. And people's response was so positive. And I suddenly realized after kind of doing that paper that there was something there that needed to be unpacked. And SEM Press were at that conference and had come to that paper and said to me, you know, are you writing anything longer on this? And I looked at David Sheverton and I said, well, no, because whilst I enjoyed giving that paper, I'm not really that interested in writing about this and doing research in this area, because as Naomi said, my research interest is actually in a very different area. And so David kept asking, I said, there's really not a book here and I'm not writing on this and I'm not interested. And then about 6 months later, I was at my desk and suddenly like the chapter headings came together and the book kind of formed itself. And I thought, well, I seem to have something here. Let me go back to him and see. And of course, he was very happy. And I signed the contract in the December of that year, which was then 2019, and signed it in a very different world. And I write about this in the preface, which is really important because I signed the contract to this book at a time when the church was not talking about race, when actually in British society, we were not talking about race. You know, the words wokeness and culture wars were not in common parlance. We were not talking about statues and monuments in the way in which we are. Black Lives Matter was not something that most people would talk about or say. You know, George Floyd hadn't happened, Ahmaud Arbery hadn't happened, Breonna Taylor hadn't happened. Like, it was a different world. You know, the pandemic hadn't happened either. So I signed the contract at a time when actually the church's conversation was very different. The kind of conversations we were having in society were not happening. And also, I signed a contract when libraries were open and the world was kind of normal. So suddenly, I found myself without libraries in a church which was willing, it seemed, to talk about race. You know, Azariah's book came out, I didn't know that that was happening. We had bishops taking the knee. So all the things that I thought I was going to say about race were not sayable because actually the conversation had changed. And it also meant that my idea of the writing process had to shift as well, because I thought, you know, I'm going to go for coffees with friends and we're going to go for dinners and I'm going to share ideas and my friends are going to tell me how wrong I am and I'll change what I'm going to say and all of that. And then suddenly it was like you're in your room on your own with the books that you can access from your shelves and some of the things you can get as PDFs online. And that's it, because you can't afford to buy every book you want to consult. My last kind of port of call was the British Library, and then they shut. So I was stuck, really. And I remember thinking, gosh, you know, I have a deadline, which wasn't extended because of the pandemic. So it was still January 2021. And I just had to get on with it. So I say that to say this is a very different book. And it's also, I think, shaped by some of the trauma of the whole lockdown experience. And also, I think the trauma of living in a world in which people seem to suddenly become aware of what it meant to be Black, you know? Suddenly, all of this solidarity and allyship came out of the woodwork, which you might think was a positive experience, but actually it wasn't. Because for me, I remember thinking, gosh, I've always known this and felt it. How is it that some people have gone through almost all of their lives not realizing what it is that most Black people experience and face? And if the focus is just on police brutality, then we haven't understood the nature of the beast, right? That actually there was a lot more to it. And then also the reality of what it meant to be Black in a time when, you know, many people were feeling this virus going around the world, particularly attacking people of color in a particular way, on top of all the other brutality that people were suffering. So that's a really long-winded way of saying that what moved me to write the book was a practical thing of giving a paper that people liked and having someone interested in the topic. And another way of saying also that it's not the book that I envisaged, it's the book that was possible with the constraints of not having libraries, not having access to the things I needed. But the other thing that also motivated me to write the book was that I couldn't see anything from a British context that addressed this topic. So the first thing I realized when I was trying to write it was how much literature from across the pond I was reading, from America. So Kelly Brown Douglas and Darnell Moore, Pamela Lightsey, M. Sean Copeland, all of these people, Brian Massingale, and their work is incredible and it's fantastic and it's groundbreaking, but it is coming out of a different context. And so I had to, at one point, just stop. I had to put down my James Cone and put down everyone else and just say, actually, that's great, but what does it mean to be Black in my body in this particular location? Because it doesn't all translate. And that was the other hard thing, was there was no one I could look to who was kind of talking about what it meant to be Black and queer in a British context, and Christian. So it did feel like I was kind of opening ground on one level, without much to refer to, and that the scope felt huge. And I was trying to kind of encapsulate almost as many voices as possible, recognizing the fact that I am, a cisgendered male as well, trying to include trans voices and lesbian voices and queer voices in my work, but recognizing that I am not those things. So how do I do that without saying too much, and without silencing people? And so realizing that this is just, I hope, opening the conversation, but not the whole thing. And so I try to encourage in the book people from other faiths, people from other identities, to also share what it's like to be in their bodies. So I will stop there, I think, in terms of just a kind of broad overview in terms of what motivated me. If people want to ask anything or ask me any more questions in terms of that, then that would be fine.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. And actually, one of my questions was going to be how did you approach this change as you were writing? But it feels like you've really expanded on that, and yeah, it sounds like it's been a journey alongside everything else that's been going on the last couple of years. So no, I think that's really gives a lot of insight into your process in developing this, and I definitely can see the need almost preceding your awareness of it, if that makes sense. Like you said, you began on this journey, and then suddenly you not in a predestination-y kind of way, but then you suddenly almost realized why. And that's both, I think, really exciting, but also can recognize the challenge, I'm sure, for you that was within that.
And it was something really important for me to kind of focus on grace as a separate thing. I mean, you can talk about this a bit more later, but without looking at grace through the lens of sin. What does it mean to write a book that actually just concentrates on the fact that people who are queer and people of color, and who are both of those things, are loved by God, without referring to sin at all, which theologically was really hard. And you realize how much we're locked into this kind of frame of not being able to talk about grace without mentioning sin. And I thought, actually, LGBTQ plus people are so used to the sin talk that I was committed to making sure I write something. It would be really interesting to know how much sin comes up in the book in terms of a word count, because I'm sure it's very little. But that also felt like a challenge in a time when I think Russell T Davies released his, It's a Sin, which is all about kind of gay culture and the AIDS crisis. And I thought that was really interesting how even that theological language in 2021 tied itself down into like the creative arts in such a powerful way, which shows part of the issue, I think, in this whole area.
Definitely. I mean, for me, reading the book, it did make me reflect on how many times I've been introduced to the concept of grace as almost a brushing over of my queer identity, and it's like, oh well, God's grace is there for us all. Really? And that doesn't feel gracious. That feels very backhanded. So no, definitely. So in terms of the structure of this conversation, we've now got some time for everyone who's joined to be able to share their reflections, to ask questions, and also just to share what they're hoping to get out of this conversation today. Why did you join, and what is it that you're hoping to get from the time that we've got together this morning? So there's an opportunity for you to unmute yourselves and share, or if you're more comfortable, you can place in the chat just reflections that you have. So I'll be slightly more clear in the ask, because I realised I've waffled that a little bit, but What we've got is, what did you learn either from reading the book or from Jarel's description and insight into his process there, and what are you hoping to get out of this time this morning in this discussion with Jarel? And yeah, like I said, please feel free to share out of mute or share in the chat.
Yeah, hi, Faith here. I'll confess first, I haven't read the book. I'm in the middle of a PhD, so I'm reading many other things. But I'm coming from a US context, so I just moved to the UK last year, and for this program, trying to get my head around what working for justice looks like here. And so I was intrigued when you were talking about having to set down the American work on race and religion, because yeah, Kelly Brown Douglas and James Cone, those are like the only American voices that I'm hearing. And so I was wondering, could you talk about some of the like biggest dissonances you found, or at least some things that didn't translate? Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great question. Good luck with the PhD, by the way, as well. I think for me, the biggest difference, what was really noticeable, was the way in which I think American writers almost not so much take for granted, but have a confidence, I think, about speaking about race and theology, particularly in the academy. So I feel like, if you think about the British context, there is no one like MLK or James Baldwin or Toni Morrison from a British context, who you can really think about in terms of those whose lives have kind of crossed that spiritual, racial kind of intersection. We've had that level of prominence. But in the States, of course, you have people like that. And so to be and I think it's changed how the academy works. So to think in the academy, particularly in theological spaces, about race and religion, in the States, that's been happening for a while. Whereas here, I mean, Anthony Reddy and Robert Beckford are the kind of two main people that I can think about, and neither of them are in a tenured position within a university as professors, as far as I know. And they're certainly not tenured within like a Black theology chair or position, which is to say that we're so behind in the academy here, but also in the church. And I think that changes, a lot of people, I think, are beginning to discover these ideas for the first time here. Whereas in the States, when I read people like Kelly Brown Douglas or James Cone, and James Cone was definitely a pioneer in that sense, even he is able to write with a certain level of confidence that some people will get him. Whereas here we just don't have that. And there is no tradition, I think. And that's the thing, there's no Black theology tradition within the church here that goes back long enough, that has been respected in any kind of mainstream. And I would say that's just one area of dissonance, but it is a major one, I think, because it does mean that in lots of spaces, people are thinking through these things here for the first time, which is not to downplay the role of Robert and Anthony, but it is to say that they are some of the only names that we can mention because they are two of the only people doing it. And then, thankfully, we have Selina Stone coming from a womanist perspective in the UK, but I can't really think of many other people, people like Evie Vernon and others, but in terms of prominence, it's just very different. And I think that definitely changes the ground. And when I look to Black queer clergy, the names that come up are people in the States. I can only think of one other priest in the UK, G.D. Macaulay, who's openly gay and who's Black, and in the priesthood. Whereas in the States, I can think of many more, And I think even the Episcopal Church, when you compare it to the Church of England, there's just so many dissonances in terms of how serious they take diversity and inclusion, which is a waffly answer to your question, but just some of the differences.
No, I thought that was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith.
I'm interested in how keen you were to approach this. I mean, addressing it from a kind of UK perspective, or I'm conscious to sometimes distinguish as well between UK and in English, I guess, as well, because there's so much obviously within that. But I mean, how conscious were you about not making this about the Church of England whilst also addressing that and just how much weight that does bear on church life within this country?
Well, it's interesting. Well, one of the things I didn't say in my introduction was that I also signed the contract for this book when I was a Methodist minister, and I gave that paper as a Methodist minister and became an Anglican in January 2020. So there was a shift also. I was at a real kind of transitory point within my own life on many levels. And so one of the things I found really interesting was that in my heart, when I referred to the church and was critical of it, I think I was thinking of Methodism on the whole. And I draw a lot, those of you who've read it might be interested that I draw a lot on Methodist scholars in the book. You know, I draw a lot on Wesley's theology and on other Methodist scholars in the book. And I think my theology of grace is heavily shaped by my Methodism as well. So I think I in my head, towards the end, when I talk about the abolition of the church, I'm thinking particularly of kind of establishment and how that embodies itself in the Church of England. And of course, having made the shift, I'm deeply conscious of how different those two churches are. You know, when I compare my Methodist ordination to my Anglican one, there was a lot I had to do in the Anglican one that I didn't have to do in the Methodist one, which just reminded you of how much the state is involved in the process of ordination. You know, oaths and declarations that in Methodism we didn't have to make. And I was much more comfortable with that, you know. And I think I felt more enabled to be a prophetic voice in Methodism than I do in the Church of England. So there's an interesting contrast there as well. So I think the church generally was in my mind, but I was deeply conscious of how problematic parts of the Church of England polity are. You know, and I talk about that when I reference things like issues in human sexuality and other things in the book. But I also critique the Roman Catholic Church as well, you know, and how it refers to people who are not heterosexual. So it is the church generally for me. And I think every church of every denomination has structures within it which directly impact LGBTQ plus lives, even those that are deeply affirming and inclusive. You know, even a church like MCC, for example, I'm sure when it comes to things like race or trans lives, probably hasn't got everything sorted, you know. And so there's something there for me about there needing to be an inner critique of the institutions we're part of and that we have belonged to.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have anything that they wanted to share or ask?
Hi, I'm Tash.
Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for the book, really. I think for me, what you said about the difference between how race is viewed in the US and the UK, I think reading your book as someone who is Black and queer and British, it kind of felt a little bit like reading Rennie Edo-Lodge's book, and like for the first time kind of hearing like a significant voice on these things, like from a UK perspective, so it felt entirely relevant. And I mean, there's loads. I mean, from the start, I just underlined so much. Like, you know, there's just so much that's relevant. But also, I think not just relevant to kind of your experience, but the experience of so many people. I think, you know, the way that you write about grace, like you said, removing the kind of sin aspect, that's so powerful. I think for any person who is trying to follow Jesus, to kind of have that sense of how much God loves them. And so I think I appreciate like your voice from our shared kind of like identities, but also kind of the far-reaching nature of the book as well. So I haven't quite finished it yet. I've got a little bit more, but I'm just excited to hear some more about it. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tash. I really appreciate that. It's been really interesting because one of the things I think people have struggled with, and those who haven't been Black and queer in terms of reading the book, is, you know, we expect lots of anti-racist books and lots of books generally that talk about race from a Black perspective to be addressing a white audience. And a lot of people have said to me, you know, we found that a different thing, and we found that slightly challenging at times, that you kind of unapologetically address people like you. And I had to kind of free myself of being too mindful of who the audience might be. I just think actually this is for people like me, and those who want to connect with it will connect with it, and it will resonate with those for whom it needs to resonate. But actually I can't worry too much about a white audience who might be straight connecting with this work, you know. And there's something really gratifying, I think, of having people who do share my experience and identity saying that it did resonate, because that was, you know, that was the whole point. So thank you.
There's a couple of comments in the chat that I'll read. So from Nessa, I really enjoyed reading this book. Just want to say thank you so much for writing it. I find it so interesting with what you're saying about the churches that consider themselves inclusive, having inner things that impact LGBT lives. I've started to see that at the church I'm currently working in, and I wouldn't have known about the unspoken stuff if I hadn't reached out and asked about their views. Bit of a broad and heavy question, but how did you deal with the opposite views around LGBT lives and being Black and queer?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think this is where I have to examine my own privilege, actually, as someone who's Black and queer, because it is possible to have it. You know, I have to admit the fact that I had 3 years studying theology in Cambridge just before ordination, and admit that meant that I was able to examine things like scripture and theology with a kind of critical lens that a lot of people who are Black and queer didn't have, you know, and that enabled me, I think, to rebut some of the crap that people kind of gave to me, because it was, you could see through it. But I realized that that's not everyone's experience. Not everyone has that opportunity. And that was an education that was on the whole paid for by the church, because I was training for ordination. And that is a thing of privilege. That's a thing of my own privilege in that sense. But I think there's something to be said for kind of, you know, depending on where you are personally, wrestling with some of the things that people throw at us, you know, and saying, how can I work through some of this stuff? Because I think you will definitely find that there's nothing to it, but it can be really affirming to be like, okay, so people say that these texts are texts that say that I can't be me. You know, let me look at what other people have said about these things. And there were amazing queer scholars who have done the work on this, and who I think are right in showing that there is nothing in scripture, when it's looked at properly with its original context, that says that people who are Black and queer can't exist. Within our own African cultures, queer people have always existed. This is something where my kind of research on bodies, monastic bodies in particular, in Egyptian late antiquity, so from St. Mark to Muhammad, basically, that time period, there were lots of queer African characters in African monasteries that we just don't know about. A lot of their work hasn't been translated. A lot of it hasn't been studied by us, by people who are Black and queer. You know, the history of the church has not been written by people like us. And so when, you know, the people who have written the history haven't been looking for people like us. So sometimes we have to do the work, but I realize that actually if we're not in that place emotionally, it can be hard. And so the other thing I would say as well is sometimes my response to people who have opposite views has been to just retreat. And that's okay, you know, because actually what we need to do is survive. And sometimes that's the appropriate response. So if you can engage in your own way with some things that help you work your way through some of the opposite views, then that's cool. But if not, it's also okay to say, I don't need to do this. So that's been, my response has been both of those at different times.
That's great. I can definitely feel the kind of, yeah, the reclamation of the power within that conversation by doing that as well, by choosing the terms on which you engage, as being really like, actually, no, this, I don't owe you an explanation, but I can give you one if you want. Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of, I think, pretty like, yeah, big questions from Alexandra in the chat. The first one being, in a world where Black bodies are deemed as inherently sinful or subhuman, and queer bodies also as inherently sinful / an abomination, where do you as a Black queer body call home? Is it a physical or is it an existential space?
Gosh, that is a big one. It's really interesting. I think that sense of home for me has shifted quite drastically, I think. And I'm not sure that in this particular world, I feel it so much. So one of the things I've always been really mindful of, and I loved Bell Hooks. I remember watching an interview with Bell Hooks once, and she's incredible. And she once said that her own actual home, so the domain in which she lives, is the one place that she is 100% committed to having no like violence against her in. So she doesn't watch things that are bloody. She doesn't let people into her home who might make her uncomfortable. Like her physical space is the place where she feels completely safe. And all the things that she needs to be comforted are there. And I always remember hearing her saying that and thinking, gosh, in a world which is so violent, and in a world which doesn't feel like home, to have one space, if it's not even a whole house, for it to be your room, to have one space in which you say, this is the place where I'm safe, where I feel as if I'm being hugged every time I walk through the door. This is a place where I have the things that I need, and where I only invite the people in that I know are going to make me feel good. This is and I don't have anything in here that makes me feel negative. That is a quite powerful mode of resistance, I think, in a world which does view Black bodies as inherently sinful, as subhuman, queer bodies as sinful, as an abomination, a world of violence. Because I think actually, I would say, when my grandmother died, who brought me up, that sense of home really began to be troubled for me. I lost that sense of home, I think, because it had been so clearly her house, and I just kind of expected that to constantly be there. And then suddenly when she died and the house was sold, I was like, well, wow, where is home? And I've moved in to so many different places since then, that for me, it's an ongoing question. And I wouldn't want to lie to say that I have that sense of safety in any physical space, really. But there is something about my actual home where I'm trying to nurture that, and where it's important that I'm conscious of that. I think often there's a tendency for those of us who are doing this work to almost lie and say that we know how to cultivate things like joy and courage and peace, and that we know where to find safety. And I'm trying to resist that by saying that I don't think I know, where that home place is necessarily. And the second question about how do you hold the tension of the richness and God consciousness of Jamaican culture and its colonial homophobic legacy? Wow. I talk about this with friends all the time. It's a really difficult one. And I was even speaking about, some Jamaican music and Jamaican artists where the lyrics are deeply homophobic. And yet if I'm at an event, like a family thing or a party where the music comes on, I find myself singing along and dancing sometimes because it does evoke in me a sense of home from my youth, right? Which is very hard to let go of. And I have this real bizarre reaction in my head thinking, gosh, why do you react? Why does your body react in this way to it? Despite what it's saying about people like you. And it's this thing of, the tension of being part of a culture that fundamentally rejects parts of your identity, which is very difficult, I think. And I would say that I don't know how to hold the tension, to be honest. Actually, that's an ongoing thing for me. And there's so much of Jamaican culture that is wedded to its colonial homophobic legacy that I don't think it's even aware of, But we are back to questions around, things like biblical illiteracy, that actually people will quote things. I mean, I've seen this within my own family, for example, just as an example. So me being gay is such a massive thing for parts of my Jamaican family. But my father, who's had children with many different women, in terms of biblical Christianity, there's no issue there. It's me who's the problem. Even if I, for the whole of my life, only had one partner and was married to that person for the whole of my life, if that person was of the same sex as me, that would be a huge issue. but my father, whose life has taken a very different shape, that's not seen as problematic within our Christian family in any way, shape, or form. And so there is this disconnect. And of course, part of that legacy is to do with the history of slavery as well, and of what it has meant to embody a certain type of masculinity within Jamaican culture as well. So I haven't answered any of those except to say that I don't know. And I'm wrestling with them.
I love that honesty, and I think that's really important to share in conversations like this. I think you say you haven't answered them, but I feel like there's so much that you just shared that is just really helpful, and really, yeah, just a thank you again for being so open with us and sharing with us in the way that you are. There's just one last question before I think we could go into some of the themes that you wanted to pull out today. It's from Luke saying, it seems like there have been many big obstacles in your way over the last year, and many of the systems that we participate in feel broken and obstructive. And with this in mind, what is giving you hope at the moment?
It's a tough one. The hope question is one that I really wrestle with. And I've been wrestling a lot with kind of ideas of what people might call Black nihilism, which is this rejection of hope as something that we have to have. And it's a really interesting thing, because I think I couldn't be someone who just says, well, hope has no place in my life whatsoever. But I am wrestling with the place it should have as someone who is Black and queer, because it sometimes seems a bit crazy to be hopeful as someone who's Black and queer, because there is not much, if anything, to be hopeful about at times. And I feel like, again, it's an invitation to participate in this lie, this kind of myth, that there are signs of progress, because often I don't actually see them, I see the opposite. And so I'm at this place where at the moment, all I kind of can commit to is the belief that I have in the truth that Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. I know that to be true. I'm committed to that. I'm not sure whether my commitment to that makes me hopeful. It means, I think, that I'm committed to tomorrow, whatever tomorrow looks like. I'm committed to the work that I have to do and that I can make sense of for myself. But I find hope almost too optimistic a thing. And I cannot see enough around me to make me hopeful if it does mean that kind of optimism. I find if it is hope, I find a lot of encouragement in the young, actually, because I find that they are growing up in a world which has endowed them, I think, with the language that they need to make a change. When I was growing up, there was no language for things like intersectionality, and people were not thinking about what solidarity looks like across the board. People were kind of committed to their own, I think, on the whole, sense of justice, whereas now I think we see solidarity and allyship coming from all kinds of places, which is wonderful. And I've seen that in my own life and been amazed by that. But there also does some things they won't put up with. When I was a university chaplain, I saw such a clear moral compass in some of the students I worked with. And I was just like, even in terms of our generational gap, which is tiny, I see a complete shift. Like they will not put up with some of the things that I would put up with. They see things happening and they just hit the streets in terms of protest immediately. Whether it was around the living wage for the cleaners at the university, or things to do with accommodation, they just hit the streets and started protesting, and they didn't need anyone to tell them to do that. They just knew. And in terms of the solidarity shown to me earlier in the year, that began with the students at King. They were the ones who said, we don't like how our chaplain is being treated. We're going to show him solidarity. And I thought they proved for me what was my gut instinct, which was that their moral compass is so deeply shaped. And if that sticks, and if that's true of the next generations, then we will be okay, because that's what we need. But again, I don't know if that's hope or if it's just a kind of conviction that they are going to be slightly more Christ-like than some of us, because they're committed to this justice thing in a kind of different way. But I do think there's something about being kind of historically, you have to be ignorant of history, I think, to be black and hopeful in this world, because the signs that things are going right back to how they used to be are all around us. And if you know history, then you can't be black and hopeful today, because there is so much in the church and in the world that is worrying, and so much complacency. So that's not a down note, it's just an honest one, I think, about where I am at the moment. And it's a real challenge for someone who has to preach every Sunday, because I think what people want is hope, but equally, Jesus says the truth will set us free. What does that mean? Joy isn't the thing necessarily that sets us free, or hope, but the truth. And I think we have to have the truth before we have hope. And that's the truth about ourselves, it's the truth about our world, it's the truth about the gospel, which doesn't always comfort us, but sometimes really shakes us up to where we're at, and that's a really tough one when you're stood in front of people on a Sunday who I think actually do want you to make them feel good, because they misunderstood what preaching is as well. And that's also our fault as preachers, that we've turned it into something that is more about entertainment often than about breaking open the word, which is a person, yeah.
There was just so much wisdom in that I kind of want you to say it all again. But no, that's just really beautiful, and I can really relate to the idea of kind of hope has almost the way that we've had to in your book you've created this space between grace and sin. We've kind of got to create this space between hope and this kind of toxic positivity that means you've got to be happy and joyful about everything all the time, otherwise you haven't really met Jesus or whatever else it is.
There is a kind of pious answer to the hope question, which I didn't say, which is actually that, as difficult as I find prayer, and as weird as it can be within my own life in terms of the shape it takes, I don't mean the formal prayer of having to be in church at 9 and 5 most days to say morning and evening prayer, but my kind of ongoing conversation with God is the place where something maybe close to hope is cultivated. I hate pious answers like that, but for me it is true, and it's a prayer that doesn't look like prayer, I think, but that is my kind of honest conversation with God about the brutality of life, I think, and my own sense of despair sometimes. Where can I hold that? I hold it in my prayer time, and it is kind of shaped in a good way to something a bit more positive in that space.
No, absolutely. It's a lot of love for you, what you've shared in the chat as well. I definitely think I'm also going to be writing down that committed to tomorrow idea. I think that's going to be helpful for a lot of people, just that actually just what is immediately in front of us, and what do we think about that, rather than the always being so up there and abstract and big picture. Not that it's not important to do both, but brilliant. Fantastic. Does anyone else have anything that they wanted to ask or share before we move on to the next little bit? Brilliant. So Jarel, I don't know if you wanted to introduce the first of the themes that you picked out for us to kind of talk about today.
So the thing that I really want to talk about at this point is this idea of the incarnation, because it's something that I think there are two things. When we talk about grace, we assume that we all know what we mean by it. And I think the thing that I know from speaking to some friends, particularly kind of theologians who work on grace in a much more systematic way, is that we really don't agree on it. So I've been kind of labeled a process theologian by some folk because I say that grace is something that we embody for each other. Another friend of mine who's a Roman Catholic was like, you really don't understand grace, do you? Because the way you wrote about it is it's not really theological. I was like, okay. And of course, he's coming from a place of of reading lots of Augustine, and Augustine ties grace up with the will and can't divorce the two. And I get where someone like Augustine's coming from. I just don't agree with it. Because I think when you tie grace up with the will, and then translate that to LGBT plus bodies, you can't communicate grace in any other way which says that we have to change who we are, or that says that grace, when it's embodied in us, would result in a kind of holiness, and that holiness being read as heterosexuality, or whatever it might be, becoming white even, for example. So I don't like tying grace up with the will, because I think that's a problem. So for me, when I think about grace, I see it as a human experience, one that we come to trust in because we feel the love of God in our flesh. We don't just hear about it, we don't just read about it. Our experience or lack of experience of grace, I think, has the deepest consequences for how we understand our own relationship to God, and how we read our own bodies, and how we understand our spiritual and physical lives. And so for me, grace is mostly embodied in the life and person of Jesus Christ, which is why for me the incarnation is so important. That grace for me can't be a theory, it has to be something that we see in Jesus. And so I suppose if you wanted to kind of attack my theology of grace, you could say that it's very Christocentric, it focuses too much on Jesus and it's not Trinitarian, which would be fine, and it's probably true, I think, if I'm honest. I haven't thought that through enough. But again, I would definitely say that grace is something that is communicated to us through the Trinity, that I would say we see it most in Jesus, because Jesus is the one who walks among us. But it's Trinitarian in that, of course, it involves the Father and the Spirit as much as the Son. Father Roger Haidt would say that everything that God does for humanity in Christ is grace, and I would agree with that. Another priest, whose name has escaped me, I quote him in the book, he's the Father Peter Groves, the vicar of St. Mary Magdalene in Oxford, says that grace is the love of God, the cruciform love of God. So grace is the love of God in the shape of the cross. And I love that as well. But the incarnation thing I come to through an African theologian, a 4th century African theologian called Saint Athanasius. And I love the incarnation because what it does, and what Athanasius does with it, is he takes this event, of Christ being born in Bethlehem, and he connects it not just to the crucifixion and the resurrection, but to each of our lives. So something that Athanasius says, and I'm paraphrasing, is that God created humankind, leaving nothing barren of his image and likeness. And so I think about that, leaving nothing barren of his image and likeness also includes the Black LGBTQ plus community, because it has to. And so what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? What does it say about our lives and about the value that our lives should have? And I write about this a little bit in the book, thinking of our bodies. So I'm going to read a bit from pages 92 to 94, and just focus on this idea of the incarnation. What does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? Despite the fact that we have woken up in them every day of our lives, our bodies, the very flesh we wear, our birthday suits, are perhaps the things we pay the least attention to. Many of us do not love, adequately tend to, or know our bodies as well as we could. Perhaps we would even be surprised at what parts of our bodies look like or feel like when seen or touched by the eyes or hands of another. Yet it is we who live in them and have done so our entire lives. Our bodies are sites of memory, of transgenerational trauma, and of contradiction. We pray with them, experience sickness in them, grieve with them, reach ecstasy in them, and at the end of everything, surrender them, or rather have them surrendered by the bodies we have known and loved, to flames or to the earth when we die. We live in this knowledge that our bodies, no matter how much we love or detest them, are both our own and not our own, that they are matter that we must one day lay down. Though we are made from dust and will return to dust, we spend our lives in our bodies mostly running away from this fact, and even doing things to deny our bodies' natural aging processes through the use of serums and surgery. The beauty of our bodies for some of us is a source of pride. And for those who see no beauty in them, they can be a source of shame, humiliation, pain, and hardship. Most of us only know our bodies as flesh that has been faithful to us, carrying us where we need to be, bending into the shapes we put them in, enduring our clumsiness and stupidity. Yet we have seen or witnessed those whose bodies are frail and weak, who may feel that their bodies are no longer keeping their word. Only grace can hold us together when black begins to crack and sickness takes hold of us. It is grace that tells us that we are more than our appearance, that our value in God is unchanging, that we are more than enough in the eyes of God, whose gaze can become the only one that matters. This attention to our bodies is something that womanist scholars in particular have been helping to push us towards. Phyllis Shepherd, a womanist practical theologian and psychotherapist, does so beautifully when she remarks, "We need to consider the body in the context of a society where certain bodies are exploited to create a desire for commodities, regardless of the need or ability to afford them. But the color of our skin continues to greatly influence our quality of life, our experiences in society, and our economic location, where sex and sexuality are used to sell entertainment infused with violence. We need to hear what the body has to tell us about being created in the image of God. As a society, we have decided whose bodies matter and whose bodies do not, whose bodies are fully functional and whose bodies are less than, whose bodies are desirable and whose bodies are undesirable. We live in a world in which the body has been abused not just in history, but in the present, crucified, drowned, burned, torn apart. This is part of the body's contradiction, its paradox, its beauty, its grace, that it is the site of so much. As children, most of us are taught about how to keep our bodies clean, tidy, and presentable, more than we are taught to enjoy the freedom of walking barefoot upon a moist lawn or paddling in a brook. Bodies are things that are kept, managed, and controlled. And although not a universal experience by any means, when you stop and ponder this for those of us for whom it is true, and reflect deeply on its consequences, you realize that not only does our bodily neglect make no sense, it is fundamentally something we cannot afford to do forever, without some great cost both to ourselves and the other bodies around us. Your body has held the unseen you for however many years you have lived, survived perhaps on this earth. Your body has persisted through things it should not have, bended itself into the shape you have shaped it into, held stresses and strains, and still through it all persisted. It deserves your attention, your love, your care. And then I go on a bit to speak about the doctrine of the incarnation and the grace that flows from Christ's birth and death and resurrection, which really has no currency if our bodies, black and queer, along with all other bodies, are not connected to this idea of the imago Dei, the image of God. So what I'm trying to touch on here in this part of the book is the fact that I think the church doesn't have a sex problem. That actually what the church has is a body problem. And I talk about the church basically being body phobic. And one of my criticisms of something like Living in Love and Faith, which we have in the Church of England, is that it concentrates so much on sex and sexuality, but not on the body generally, you know? And I think if we were able to talk about our problems with the flesh, we would be able to understand why it is that we have arrived at this place where, you know, we've had to spend so many years talking about whether women can be priests and be bishops, and now so many years talking about whether people who are of the same sex can be married in church. And I think what's at the heart of that is something that we would call Docetism, which is basically a lack of belief that God really does become flesh in Christ. I think that's the church's issue, is that we don't really believe in the incarnation. Because if God becomes flesh in Jesus, that sorts out so much of our issues. Because if God is content to be human, we have to be content to be human, and we have to be content to allow other people to be human. And so it kind of solves our body problem. But there is nothing in LLF and nothing in lots of the church's documents around sexuality that get to the heart of how troubling it is to believe in the incarnation. You know, that actually God was content to pass through an opening in Mary between urine and feces. You know, it's that visceral that God was content to be born like all of us. And until we get to that, to the kind of the visceral reality of what it means to be incarnate, we can't have a conversation about sexuality that gets us anywhere. You know, because there'll always be the next thing. You know, we'll sort out equal marriage, there'll be the next thing. It's not going to be the end of the road. And you know, the next thing, of course, would be trans identity, which the church can't get its head around at all. And that was also to do with the body, right? To do with the flesh, and how we think human flesh ought to function and the place it ought to take. You know, that's really what's at the heart of some of the conversations that the church is trying to have around these things. So I have questions really just about how we might think about the incarnation, whether we think we place too much emphasis, for example, on something like the crucifixion and resurrection. You know, I had someone say to me the other day in an art gallery, I was walking around in my collar, and she said to me, you know, I have to say that one of the things that's more important for me is the Christmas story than the Easter story. And she found it really controversial. And I was like, wow, at last I found someone who feels how I do. Because for me, actually, the incarnation is so much more important than the crucifixion and resurrection, which can be controversial. But I think without the Christmas story, there's no flesh to crucify and no one to rise from the dead. But the emphasis in church has been placed in the wrong place, and it's affected everything. So I would love to hear what other people have to say. Push back if you need to, queries, questions, feel free to be honest. We have a question from Faith, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to be late for something else, but I don't care. So I have to talk to you about this because my PhD is on atonement. And one of my central points is that the crucifixion and atonement has been divorced from incarnation. And so that's something that I'm working on. And so this is kind of a big question, but one of the big challenges I've been having in my work is reading white feminists, white American feminists, and the way that they draw from feminist theory that and liberal theory more broadly about the right to autonomy over one's body and this idea of instrumental control. I have M. Sean Copeland's In Fleshing Freedom on my shelf, about to get into it. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to this idea of like autonomy in the body and what that says about like incarnation and redemption even. Sorry, big questions, but yeah.
I think the first thing to say is to kind of touch on that thing about the incarnation being divorced from the crucifixion and resurrection. You know, it's really a modern thing. It's not something that the patristic thinkers do. So the early church mothers and fathers don't do that. And it's, you know, for Athanasius, for example, and for people like Origen, and for, you know, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus, the incarnation is on a kind of continuum, actually, that Christ is also becoming incarnate on the cross. And so God in Christ, it's hard because it sounds like heresy when I put it this way, but it's not. God in Christ becomes more human on the cross as much as in the cradle. So God is taking on flesh, yes, in the incarnation in Bethlehem, but it's not done. You know, God is actually seen at God's most human in Christ as God suffers. Athanasius wouldn't say that. He doesn't believe in divine impossibility, so he does. I mean, he doesn't believe that God suffers in Christ. He would make this distinction between the flesh and the word, and he would say that it's the flesh of Christ that bears the suffering, but the word doesn't feel that. But he would still believe that the incarnation is kind of continuing up until the point of crucifixion, and that they're not divorced from each other. So it's a really complicated way of seeing the incarnation. I think when we talk about it, and I probably make that mistake in the book as well, is I see it as almost being done at the point of Christ's birth. But the church fathers and mothers wouldn't say that. For them, the whole of Christ's life is about him revealing to us what it means to be truly human. And part of that is his suffering on the cross and also his resurrection. And what it means to have the bodies that we will have in eternity is to rise from the dead and for death to be abolished. And they would use the language of abolition when speaking about death, which when you think of that in the face of the empire is very powerful language, actually, that for someone like Athanasius and Origen and people like Cyprian, death is abolished in Christ. And that means that the powers of the empire don't have the last word. Bodily autonomy, I mean, there's something about the incarnation, I think, that means that, and something about the Christian life, that means that to some degree we're not autonomous, actually. You know, that I think what it means to be baptized, you know, that idea that water is thicker than blood in the life of the church means that we are all, to some degree, responsible for one another. And therefore, my life is deeply tied up with yours, and yours is deeply tied up with mine. And the desire to be autonomous is almost anti-gospel, which is challenging, I think, you know. And this is why I worry sometimes in our current culture about language like self-care, because I don't think it exists. Actually, I do need to be cared for, and I cannot care for myself. Actually, my own well-being is something that I cannot provide myself. I need the love, care, support, awareness of other people to be properly whole. And this language of self-care, whilst I get where it comes from, I think within a Christian framework is problematic, because actually, you know, you need me to be whole and I need you to be whole, and we need to help each other be whole, you know. And I think one of the things about Christ is that he is not autonomous, actually. You know, he needs people, he needs help carrying the cross. You know, the stone is rolled away by angels. You know, he needs help to be born. He needs Mary. You know, so actually Christ is not autonomous. And I think that's really important. And there's something about autonomy which I think can be deeply dangerous, you know. And the church, I think, embodies a desire to be autonomous, which is the most unhealthy. You know, it wants to be autonomous from God often, which is part of the reason we're in the situation we're in as well, you know.
Thank you for that. I've been shrieking online to some of my friends about some of the frustrations that I've been reading, and that's so helpful. Thank you. I do have to go now, but thank you so much.
Really lovely to meet you. Bless you.
Yeah, you too.
Okay.
Two things that conversation really brought out for me was I really hear what you're saying about self-care. I work within health, and this is something that it mirrors, I think, the way that certain like climate actions have been put onto like personal responsibility as well, and we want to reduce everything down to a person's individual choices as what's going to make the difference. But I mean, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that doesn't work. We do things together or it doesn't function. And for me, the idea of the incarnation really came true to me as I learned, again, like through my own research, more about kind of neuroscience and the way people's brains work. And actually, if God is to show us what love means for us as humans, we have to understand that on a human level. And for me, that's why Jesus makes so much sense, because I'm like, if God's going to express love to us, we have to understand that as a human, because that's what our brains do. That's the only way that we can understand things. And so, yeah, I just love so much. I was just sat there nodding like, yes.
I would really recommend for anyone, if you can read Athanasius's work on the incarnation. It's so readable, and patristics is my thing. So the study of the early church is my thing. And one of the things I'm really committed to is reminding people that this is not literature for the academy, that actually Athanasius was writing for people like us who were trying to make sense of this Christian thing in a world which was turbulent and unstable and changing. It's perfect for now. And it's not for theologians, it's for all of us. And these people were bishops and priests and lay people writing for Christians. And so don't just neglect it or disregard it. So his book on the incarnation, I'll put it in the chat.
I'm really pleased to hear someone other than the voice in my head, which I'm worried about voicing because I'm worried I sound heretical, say that the most important thing Jesus did, I'm saying this the wrong way around. In the church, I hear a lot that Jesus showed his love for us by dying on a cross, right? Yep. I think what's more, I know I sound like a heretic. I'm a Methodist minister. Lots of people know this thing. But actually, although I know that's really important to everyone, I'm actually more impressed with, as you say, the incarnation itself. Like, why put yourself in that really vulnerable position? Like, really, you've got to love humanity a lot to want to do that. And then, I'm sorry, let's not worry too much about grace at Jesus' death. Please forgive my heresy. You perhaps should not put this in the record. Actually, let's look at Jesus' life, actually. Yeah. How did Jesus relate to people? Every time he met somebody who'd been othered, every time he met somebody who everybody else wanted to stone, every time he met somebody that no one else was even listening to, his just life is grace, grace, grace. It's not about deserving. And that's the entire point. And I get, sorry, I'll shut up in a minute. I get really frustrated that all the church hears when it sees people is, oh, are you a sinner? Do you need to be saved? Where does Jesus even talk about sin or hell to anyone who's not a religious leader?
Yeah.
Anyone who's not being a judgmental, rude word, won't say it on the recording, it doesn't get Jesus's wrath at all. If I'm being judgmental, I'm a religious leader, I would get the full weight of it, actually. If I'm not being judgmental, Jesus will have me around for dinner or invite himself to my house. That's right. If I am, I get the whole, you whitewashed serpents, you whitewashed wolves, you serpents, you snakes, you're all going to watch yourselves. Jesus doesn't speak like that to anyone who isn't being a judgmental idiot, actually. And I get really frustrated what the church gets from Jesus's life is, well, you're all going to hell.
Absolutely.
I don't even understand how we get that from looking at the life of Jesus, let alone if you want to unpack some very interesting New Testament ideas about Jesus's death, which I've been unpacking myself, which is why I realize I'm a heretic at the moment. I'm sure I'll work myself back to his Christian tradition at some point. But I just find it really frustrating that this whole obsession with who isn't a sinner isn't Jesus's obsession. So why does it belong to the church so much? I don't understand how we think we're following Jesus when we go around just assessing whether other people are sinners or not, when Jesus just sees people, treats them with love and compassion. And I believe that's what grace is about. And I don't understand where the rest of it actually comes from. Yeah, sorry. So I was really encouraged to hear you saying that the incarnation to you is more exciting than the crucifixion, because I see the crucifixion as what happens to people who live in grace. Yeah. And then what God has to say to that is, oh, I'm back. You thought you killed off love, and you thought you killed off grace, and you thought you killed off kindness, and you thought you killed off justice. Yeah, you didn't, because you can't do that. So that's what gives me a kind of sense of not optimism. I don't feel that optimistic always. I'm quite an intense, miserable, morbid kind of soul. But the hope I have is that God's with us in it, and that love will eventually win, even if I don't always see that. I believe that's true. So thank you. I'm excited to.
Thank you.
Hear you.
Amen to all of that. I have.
The sermon. By the way.
It was fantastic.
Terrible sermon.
Amen to all of that. I have nothing to add apart from an amen. That was, yeah. I'm completely there. I think. I sometimes jokingly say that the year 312 was the worst year for the church in the whole of its history, because as soon as we got into bed with the empire. Yeah, absolutely. I think that really was the beginnings of. I think having a view that was seen as orthodox was problematic, but as soon as the orthodox view became the establishment view, and the two things went together, at that point, I think an image of Jesus was formed. Yeah, it has nothing to do with scripture. Nothing to do with the Jesus that we see in the Gospels, and we have not been able to give that up.
The church becoming respectable was the thing that helped it spread, but also the thing that kind of killed it, because suddenly you had to be rich and middle class in that context to go to church, because Constantine had converted, and it's all very respectable. And if you're a respectable citizen, you go to church. So yeah, as we all know, I'm sure this is what drove lots of actual real Jesus followers out into the desert, because they couldn't stand the church anymore, because it was people who just were, yeah. Sorry, I've taken too much of your time. I was determined to just listen today.
I'm glad you didn't just do that. Actually, persecution and martyrdom can teach us a lot, and there's something in that, I think, which reminds the church of what it's really meant to be about often. And you know, when that was lessened because of what happened in this history, it looked like a positive, but the legacy of that we are definitely still living. I see Alexandra has their hand up. Do they want to ask their question?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thank you, Jarel, for a wonderful presentation, and also for responding to my my earlier questions. I know it was quite intense for a Saturday morning, but I appreciate that. I guess I wanted to sort of comment and reflect also on the conversation you had previously regarding bodily autonomy. I think you're correct in saying that this church really does have this very unhealthy preoccupation with the body, but I think I would perhaps go further and say that it has a very unhealthy and a very damaging understanding of what it means to be human. And I think it's very deep in a Eurocentric, white Western understanding that to be human is to be self-sufficient. Essence, to be a body that knows everything and wants to know nothing.
Yeah.
And Dr. Willie Jennings, in his book After Whiteness, really does take the church to task on this. I think he does a brilliant job in this. Without sort of being self-indulgent, I apologize if it does come across as such. I'm a teacher, and I'm very much trying to push the decolonial agenda. I created a unit on artificial intelligence, but one of the first things I wanted to do was ask the question, what does it mean to be human? So I kind of explored that with my students from a Western, but also from an African philosophical perspective. And I hope you don't mind if I just sort of share just a short extract of a handout that I created. Excuse me. At the heart of African cosmology, the study of the universe, is the unwavering belief that everything is in relationship and connectivity. As a result, African philosophy makes the claim that the origins, the nature, and the structure of the universe is in relationship with all beings, most notably humans. Within African philosophy, community and communal bonds is at the epicenter and meaning of life, and thus both play an integral role within African traditions, community life, and the understanding of every individual's place within the world. At the core of African philosophy is that, regardless of whether in the context of the one or the many, self is only understood when in relation to other things or other people. Without the energy of relation, the individual does not exist. In other words, individuals only become real when they are in relationship with a community or a group. It is the community that makes the individual. Consequently, when asking the question, what is an African, or by extension human, AP redresses and simultaneously responds to this question through stating the African can only be understood as being with. And there's just a really short quote by the disability activist Kim Oliver, and I think she really powerfully, succinctly sums this up. She says, the ancestral line that exists within me allows me to be more expansive on the ideas of self. Even on the surface, I know that I come from people who achieved great things. Thus, I am not an individual, I am a legion. I owe it to all of us. As a result, this creates a collective I. Through understanding myself as a collective I walk knowing that I am not alone. I have dignity, I have purpose, I have the ability and capacity to achieve great things. It is in my blood, history, and lineage. To learn and know this about yourself is not a privilege, it is a birthright. And her quote ends there. But I think there is something in understanding yourself to be self-sufficient. And as you said previously, when you don't know your history, you don't know yourself, and you don't understand the ways in which you have come to be, and the ways in which you have come to enjoy what it is that you deem as normal, or more to the point, your birthright. And I think the church, and I think that's where whiteness is really coming to show itself. And on some level, we've all internalized it, regardless of the color of our skin. So yeah, I just wanted to share that reflection. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful and so profound. I think it's, yeah, I connected with that completely. And there are so many thoughts in my mind having heard that, which I think definitely, the big Willie Jennings' work is incredible. I think it is such a robust pushback on what whiteness has done to theology and what whiteness has done to theological education, and the way in which it has limited our understanding. Cosmology, for example, just understanding our place within the wider universe is such a basic thing, but so necessary. And the other place where I feel that is in the early church writings. Actually, they were so deeply connected to nature, and to understanding themselves within the context of the whole beyond the human, which is a beautiful thing. And so much of that comes out of an African context, but it's never been taught or written about as African by most people, and so there's definitely for me something about reclaiming a tradition which already exists rather than feeling that we have to create something anew often as well, which I'm discovering for myself.
Yeah, those are really beautiful reflections, and thank you, Alexandra, for sharing that with us. That feels really special. Yeah, and the floor is still open for people to ask questions or put things in the chat. Or alternatively, we can also move on to the next little bit that you prepared for us, Jarel.
Sure. Is that a question? I mean, it's something that was said, I think Naomi mentioned it earlier, how love is at the heart of the incarnation, and the other beautiful thing, and I promise this is the last time I mention him, but the other beautiful thing about Athanasius' work is that he is so convinced that the motivation in the incarnation is love. That it is so clear for him that God doesn't become flesh to complete some kind of scheme or system or because it's convenient, but actually, and it's not just justice, it's not just putting what went wrong right. The motivation in the incarnation is love, and it is so that we could see God's face and so that God could dwell among us and could live as one of us. And to hear someone so early articulate that in such a profound way, and he is writing to defend the church against the Arians at that point, who were saying all kinds of things about Jesus, which I have sympathy for in terms of how they came to their conclusions about where Jesus fit into the Trinity and how human or divine he was, all of that stuff. But Athanasius was really trying to say we can't diminish the divinity of the child in Bethlehem, because if we do that, we lose something profound. And that's why he writes this text on the incarnation, is that he's not willing to see the child in Bethlehem as anything other than God. And I love that he does that. And of course, it is thanks to who we might call heretics, that we have that text and that pushback. So heresy has its place to play, because we would never have these beautiful texts if it wasn't for people who had original thought. So, I have a lot of time for heresy because it's very important in making Christians think through why we believe what we believe. Do we want to move on then to the next thing? Unless there are any other questions? Or?
I think so, yeah, unless anyone else has something to add or ask.
I mean, I had two questions for the group, really, that I would be interested to hear other people's reflections on. So one of them is, if we're thinking about grace and this whole incarnation thing, what is grace to you? How would you define it? Because I think, and I'm reflecting on what Ruth has said here, and it's one of the criticisms friends of mine have of my theology, is that I do see grace also through the lens of the cross. And a friend of mine who is trans was saying, you talk about the wounds of Christ speaking to the wounds of the trans community, but actually that ties up our experience with violence, if you like, with woundedness. And I also remember Pamela Lightsey in her foreword kind of hinting at the fact that, we have to find a way of reading Black experience through another lens, and not constantly through the lens of the cross, which is complete. Both of those, I don't know if they're criticism, both of those observations are definitely fair. And I think it's interesting, it's telling that I go to the cross so quickly. That says something again about kind of where I am positioned in terms of my own theological thinking, right? In terms of my proximity to the cross as a tool that I reach through to make sense of my own experience. So what is grace to you, and where do you experience it? Would be just two things that I'd be really fascinated in hearing from other people. How might you define grace, if at all?
I think I'm not going to share like a definition, but more, I guess, the journey that I'm on in terms of understanding how much my own kind of theological understanding has been shaped by what I've been taught previously. And so kind of my background is that I've spent many years in evangelical churches. And so, you know, when asked about grace, it's kind of like, you know, the undeserved kind of favor of God. But even that is kind of in the context of kind of sin, like you're so bad, you don't deserve it, but here's grace for you. And I think it's really like, you know, in the book with what you said about grace and the things that you shared this morning, to be better able to challenge that, that kind of teaching about grace, which like the more I think about it, especially this morning, seems so superficial. Even what we've been saying about the incarnation, like it made me think of, in the Message translation in John chapter 1, it says like God became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. And that's really good news, but it kind of stops there, because we're just going to look at that one way. He moved in because you're so bad and you really need him, but that's all we're going to talk about. And so I think, I don't know, I think the thing for me to take away is that question, really, to work on what would be my definition of grace. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think there's this interesting thing for me about the difference between grace and mercy. And I think actually that grace is often framed as mercy, actually. And that's really problematic, because when grace is spoken of as basically being mercy, it means that the starting point is always from the place of someone having been in the wrong. And actually, so that, you know, God stoops down to your wrongness and is willing to kind of engage with you in your wrong situation. Whereas I think grace is so much more benevolent than that, actually. Grace sees us as the beloved child of God, full stop, you know, before anything else, without any terms or conditions or footnotes or small print. It's just, you're God's beloved, you know, there's nothing else to say on that. And of course, that's the thing I think that some of the early Christian writers are talking about as well, is that for them, you know, even beyond Christ, everything of God's interaction with the world is from a point of grace. So some church mothers and fathers would talk about even the voice in the burning bush being the voice of Christ, and that being God's gracious engagement with humankind, which is, yeah, just an interesting concept, but it's there. Ruth, did you want to say something as well?
Yeah, I think you very nearly answered this, but how therefore would you distinguish between grace and love? And are they interchangeable, perhaps even in your book?
Yeah, I think for me they're probably the same. I think they are interchangeable. I think I would say love at its best is grace. You know, I think love, human love, even, although I don't think we're able to completely show it to each other at its peak. I think love at its kind of zenith is grace, really. You know, it's the deepest kind of love is grace, because it is unchanging.
Because I think some of the connotations of grace that you've explained in the book and just now, and how people inextricably link it to the flip side of being forgiven for sin, and of course all of the issues surrounding Black queer bodies that you've spelled out, and how people associate that with sin. I don't know how to explode the understanding of grace to take that away from it. And that's exactly what you're trying to do, and that's why I find your book so helpful. But it's hard to find the words. I didn't know how to answer your question. How do you define grace? And I just kept thinking of love, but I'm not saying I'm right. I think there's more work to be done. So
Cool.
thank you.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, it is how Peter Groves defines grace. He says it's it is the love of God in the shape of the cross. So he uses the word love to define grace. I think it's really hard for us to understand it in any other way. But it does tie it, and this is why the experience of love is so important, because actually it ties it into our human experience of care and inclusion and compassion, that we can only, I think, understand grace to the extent that we have experienced it. Yeah. Luke, do you want to ask your question or say something about grace?
Sure, yeah. This isn't an idea that I've really fully formulated. It's sort of an ongoing discussion in my head through my research, but I'm finding that more and more, whenever I think about grace, I think about the Spirit. And I know that we've talked a lot about Christology and incarnation, but I think, particularly as I become more influenced by a combination of kind of the Eastern Orthodox theology of theosis and then process theology interpretations of that, there's something for me about how grace is deeply interwoven in that process of the Spirit raising us up into the life of Christ, and how the Spirit loves bodies. Almost everywhere in the Bible where the Spirit is mentioned in Old and New Testaments, obviously conceived of differently in the Jewish tradition, but there's something about the Spirit hovering over bodies or hovering over matter in the creation, hovering over the womb of Mary, hovering over the body of Christ at his baptism, hovering over the church at Pentecost. So for me, when I think grace, I immediately think of the work of the Spirit raising bodies and matter into the life of Christ. So I wondered if you could reflect maybe on, where is your pneumatology in the stuff that you're looking at? I'd be really interested to hear. Because I know that pneumatology, as you know, my research is on pneumatology's admission in the Church of England, and the Church of England just really doesn't know what to do with the Spirit. So I think that's common to white European Christianity. So yeah, I wonder if you could reflect on that a little.
Sure. I don't go there in the book, but I think it's something that someone like Origen of Alexandria has helped me think through, which is that if I was to put a kind of strong pneumatology in the book now, it would come after the talk about the abolition of the church. So I'm talking about how the thing about grace is that it enables us to see ourselves as God sees us and to see each other as God sees the other, right? And I think if I wanted to place my pneumatology in the book somewhere in a useful way, I would probably talk about the practice of prayer and how the Spirit in that practice enables us, how prayer changes us, and that being the work of the Holy Spirit. And that actually, for me to see myself as God's beloved and for me to see you as God's beloved, there is a transformation that needs to happen. And I would see that work, I think, as the work of the Holy Spirit in us. I think that's the place I would want to put it most. And so the transformation of the church, which is really what I mean by abolition, it's not reform, but I do mean the birth of the church, comes through our own conviction that things can't stay the way they are, but also the conviction that I need to see other people as God sees them. And for that conviction to come, I would say that is the work of the Holy Spirit, of convicting us that something needs to change, and of enabling us to shift our lenses, I think, of the reality that's in front of us in terms of how awful the church is for many people, and to be convicted of the fact that there is a famine of grace, and then to do something about that, for me would be where I would talk about the work of the Spirit. And maybe the other place, although I didn't want to go there in this book, is to talk about, if we were to talk about sex more, and to talk about bodies more, I would want to talk about the education of desire rather than the removal of desire, and I think in patristic theology, what most early church thinkers would say is that we are programmed to desire the thing that's closest to us, which is our own flesh, and outside of that, the flesh of the other. And what we would want to do as Christians is desire the thing that is truly close to us, which of course is the Spirit of God. And we educate our desire to desire God through prayer, through the practice of prayer. So I think that's where my pneumatology in this particular text would come. And I think where it sits for me personally is through that transformation that I think the Spirit brings to us in and through prayer, mostly. So I hope that's an answer. I think my pneumatology, like my atonement theory, is still being worked out. I'm preparing some candidates for confirmation who are being confirmed later today at St. Paul's. And on Sunday, they asked me all these kind of questions about, the crucifixion and how do we know it was really Jesus? And, how is it possible that God could suffer? And I suddenly realized that my atonement theory is crap and hasn't been sussed out or worked out. And actually it comes up in this book as being just as poor and as shoddy as it is. And I think the kids could tell. So I need to work on that one. And Ruth has helped me remember that as well. It's not sorted for me.
If I go back to the grace thing. Oh, sorry, other people want to speak.
No, I was just thinking about, I loved what you said earlier. I wrote it down, but the human experience, the feeling the love of God in our flesh as being how you define grace. And I was making me reflect on like my own experience of feeling like grace was something for other people, not me. Like that my job was like to offer other people grace, and that was so much easier than to receive it myself. And some of that was like, from the traditions that I was raised in, of this kind of really, I don't know, it's all about going inward into yourself to search out the deep, dark secrets of your soul and confess them. And I realized there was like a pivotal moment in my spirituality where I realized that I was equating intimacy with God with finding a sin deep in my heart that I could confess. And I realized kind of like in a moment that how deeply unhealthy that was, that isn't how God relates to me on a, and that like also then in that moment feeling God's pleasure in who I am, and that God loves me in a pure way that's, I'm, like, it's not that I don't have any problems or things that I can, stand or, in that way, but the way that I have been taught to work it out by myself is so unhealthy, and that, the way that we work things out is together in community. And that's like, that is the healthy way. And I guess I kind of keep thinking about how we want, like in my church community, to be people that offer grace to other people, but that actually the grace and the love that I receive is just as important. And because if it isn't true, well, I say this all the time now, it's like, if it isn't true for me, that God loves me and actually takes pleasure in me, how can I communicate that that's true for you? So that's not a quick and easy definition, but that's kind of how I experience it and I love the linking of it with the physicality of the human experience too. Yeah.
So thank you. That definitely resonates with me.
On the grace thing, I think I was taught like grace is about undeserved love. And then the very idea of putting the word deserve near love is actually quite twisted, because I don't love everything Philip Yancey does, but his little quote on the back of his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, there's nothing you can do to make God love you less, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. And the idea that the church, and maybe I've been taught too, to apply deserving and undeserving to other people, and even to myself, when it's talking about love, is just really sad, actually. I recently had my sister and her little kids to stay. I love them with every breath in my body. It doesn't occur to me whether they do or don't deserve that. Like, actually, when one of them's kicking off and screaming about something, I don't love them less. I want to make life better for them. And why would God love less? And some of you are parents, I'm sure, and you know much more than I do about these things. But even being an auntie, one of the biggest privileges of my life, I get that you don't love someone smaller than you who's still learning less because they haven't got it yet. Actually, you just love them because you love them. Love isn't about deserving. So even the fact that we talk about undeserved love is just to me, it's just a misunderstanding of the word love. And I think as well, graciousness is about how Jesus lived.
Mm.
So that kind of thing about love just being something that just flowed from him makes me feel like being in God's love should be kind of like being under a waterfall or a really, really nice power shower. Yep. Where I'm just kind of bathed in that sense of wholeness and just being loved as I am, and it not being whether I'm good enough or not. I'm sure I would come a falling out short, but that isn't the point of love anyway. Love isn't ticking off, oh, she behaved nicely at dinner, but she spat her pudding out. No, maybe she doesn't, you know, we went for a nice walk and then she screamed that she wanted an ice cream. I'm thinking of toddlers. God isn't doing that. Actually, I think it's a misunderstanding that maybe the church has enjoyed using to try and keep us in line or something. The whole opium of the people stuff, like, well, if you do this and this and this, then God will bless you. Like, what? Like, again, life of Jesus, tell me where that is. Sure.
I mean, there's something there for me about the fact that, you know, the incarnation makes no sense. Love makes no sense, which is why I think the Christian message is so difficult sometimes. You know, the true message, the only one we really have to proclaim, makes no sense to people because it doesn't. You know, in our world where everything is transactional and everything comes with terms and conditions, and where you always have to wonder what the hidden catch is, you know, to have a message that you are loved regardless, you know, that you're loved full stop, by the one who made the universe and made you, it makes no sense at all. So that's love at its heart. You know, it doesn't make sense. And I think the church has tried to make it make sense and has got into all of these difficulties where it has become something that has something like deserved in front of it, and you know, or undeserved. And at that point, you lock yourself into something that's very hard to get yourself out of. Very hard.
And the whole idea, sorry, about I was part of the Billy Graham stuff. I went forward at a thing and I said the prayer. That meant I was a Christian.
Cool.
Yeah, that was it. Like, if you've said the prayer, that means you're saved forever, right? That's great, yeah. And then they didn't do any follow-up care with me because both my parents were preachers. We won't go into that. But the kind of idea then that I got encouraged to do, well, if people have said they believe in Jesus, then, you know, they're saved forever now. Again, I feel completely missing the point of what Jesus was actually about, and the fact that it's all about love anyway. That isn't about me, by all means, say the prayer, go for it, but it's not really the point.
It's not it. There's more. Yeah.
We need it to be a little list of things we can do to make ourselves good enough, and then God can love me because I've said the prayer and I go to church and I tithe and we're talking about love. Love's wild and free. Love doesn't care about your list, Ruth. Really.
Oh, so true. That's so true. Do we want to move? Oh, go on, Penny. Yep.
Just very briefly, I've just found this whole conversation so helpful. Ruth, what you said earlier on, and we're saying you were heretical, I was in tears because it hit so home for me. And Jarel, when you say about what do we think of as grace, and totally for me, it's this is about sort of undeserved favor and how unhelpful that is. And I do know the love of God, and what you say about prayer that isn't prayer, but is somehow that sense of, for me, being accompanied by love is what is, I find, the most life-giving thing. And I guess that's part of that's incarnation, isn't it? That's God with us. Yeah. Whereas all the kind of grace and sin and everything, I can't, it ties me in knots and just adds into my self-hatred and self-loathing, which is just really hard work and seems to be against God. So it's really hard, the whole kind of gospel message, which I have grown up with, and everything, and this core of crucifixion and resurrection, which is the core, but also somehow needs this reinterpretation. But I've just found this so helpful. So thank you everybody.
Thank you for sharing that as well. I think it's something that, you know, all of us can, I'm sure, connect with, that sense of, you know, knowing what the truth is, but actually feeling that is really difficult. And it's kind of getting the head and heart connection, which is difficult. And then one of the things I think the church was meant to be was the place that made believing that possible, because we told each other. We lived that. And it's something that Willie Jennings says, that the church needs to become the place where we can desire each other as God's beloved, but we have demonized desire to be such a unhealthy thing that we don't even know what it means to desire one another, without constantly thinking of desire in the sexual sense. What does it mean to hold each other close intimately in Christian community, which was the whole point. But we made it so hard now. And if we were able to go to that place where we could have the what Willie Jennings calls the revolutionary intimacy that we need in church, maybe we could believe what God says about us a bit more, because we would feel it, which is my kind of hope for the church, in some way.
I was really, really quickly going to say, I was thinking about, before you asked the question, I was thinking about this last night, actually, and as we were preparing for this, what my definition from grace is. And I thought about grace periods, when you buy something that's like a bit too expensive, and so they're like, we'll give you 30 days to backtrack. And what I kind of boiled it down to was grace being the idea that our goodness is eternal, but our mistakes aren't. And that being an expression of love, that actually that is what endures, and all the other crap won't last forever. And for me, that's what grace felt like. It's that leniency almost within this like really intricate connected system that we live in, that actually what's going to last is that which is good, and everything else will get absorbed and healed and won't. So yeah, that's what I kind of ended up with.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Another hard concept to kind of really get, but I'm committed to it. The things that we want to be true are probably the things that are true. And actually I often have this feeling of, what would it look like if we just took God at God's word, actually, and didn't make it more complicated, but actually just, what if God meant everything that God has said in the person of Christ, and what if it is that simple?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Interesting. I think the one place where I think the church gets it right is in its liturgy. If you read something like a baptism liturgy or a confirmation liturgy, and you hear what the church says to us in it, it's so powerful and profound. And that, if that is true, then it's got it right there, I think. Something like today, we have confirmation later on, and one of the things the bishop will say to the people being confirmed is, God has called you by name and has made you his own. And if that, that's such a profound statement. And my big question is, what would it mean for the church to live that statement out in every area of its life? If God has called the person that's being confirmed by name and has made them God's own, then why is it when that person goes to be ordained, if they happen to be LGBT+, that they have to sign up to things that actually say the reverse? That, maybe God hasn't called you by name, and maybe hasn't claimed you as God's own. Why is it the church can't live out what it says in its liturgy throughout the whole of its life? And even the baptism liturgy in Methodism used to say, all this for you before you could know anything of it. That's so powerful. You don't have to understand what's happening. All this is for you before you could get it, and you may never get it because it doesn't make sense. What would it mean to live that out in every area of our life? So we haven't got it wrong everywhere, but there is a disconnect.
Absolutely. Yeah, Ruth is agreeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
We get a lot wrong in the Methodist Church. I won't go into that right now, but one of the things I love is the infant baptism service, where that very prayer you've just said, and I deliberately learnt it when I was doing a lot of those, so I could look at the child and the family as I said it. And I love that although they kind of have to renounce evil so that the other churches will accept our baptism, actually the promises about bringing their child up in faith and doing this and doing that are after the baptism. I love that, and that's very deliberate. the baptism is God's showing I love you anyway. If you then want to commit, fine, but actually the commitment isn't what makes you loved.
And there's all of that repetition that, you know, for you, Christ came into the world, for you, he lived.
All this for you before you could
Yeah,
believe.
it's brilliant. Having
It's not
done
conditional. Yeah. And we've made it conditional, except just occasionally in our liturgy we work it out.
It's wonderful.
Beautiful. I'm conscious actually I've completely lost track of time because this has been so incredible. But yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left of the time that we agreed to take from people on your Saturday morning. But I do think that this last question that you were going to ask us, Jarel, was really important and a beautiful way to close this. So I don't know if you want to go ahead with that bit.
Of course. So the question I really had was, you know, we've spoken a lot about grace, and one of the things that I'm talking about, the institution I'm challenging with this understanding of grace is of course the church, you know, and I think quite clear in the end that I don't think that the system that we have can be reformed. So my question was really, what might it feel like to live in a church where oppressive structures are abolished? What might it look like or feel like to actually get rid of some of the things that create this famine of grace? You know, I think actually Methodism has shown us one clear way of doing that in its recent conference, where it basically said, you know, we're going to marry people regardless of who they are, and we're going to make this decision now, and we're not going to have a long, I mean, there was a fairly long consultation process, but it wasn't as long as I think it will be for us in the Church of England. And they made a decision, and it was a one that was a majority voice on that, you know. What might that look like in other churches? And even if it's not nationally done, what might it look like locally, to get rid of structures that separate us? One of the things I was going to do was read the bit about in the book towards the end, which is called "I'm Tired of This Church," which is a bit of the book where I speak about this little boy who stands up. He's a 6-year-old black boy in America, and a microphone is thrust into his face, and he's meant to say something positive. And the thing that he says to the gathered congregation is, "I'm tired of this church," and he passes the microphone back to an adult and walks away. And I was talking in the book about how I resonate with Nazir, that 6-year-old boy, about, you know, not being tired of the church, but being tired of this church, the church that we have, the one that we've settled for. So in closing, really, just any reflections on what might change and how?
I think following on from a lot of the stuff that we've discussed here, I'd love to see a church which becomes countercultural again, in the sense of demonstrating connection and community and taking care of each other, and not even necessarily having to call that church and feel that kind of separation from everything else and everything that we want to say isn't Christian or whatever, but actually just that demonstration of how we belong to each other, and doing that well is what I'd love to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just going back to what you said about being black and not being that hopeful, just the idea of kind of what it would take to reform the church is obviously just huge. But I think I'd like to see churches where the leadership was completely different and wasn't like male dominated and wasn't white dominated. And I think, you know, like you said about the students at university, there's a generation like coming, or that is here really, that sees leadership that is so different to the leadership structures that we're so familiar with. And I think another thing that stands out to me about, you know, just thinking about a future church, like since going to inclusive gathering, what I've realised is that, like, by including LGBTQ people, like there's also a focus on including everyone else, and that to me, again, from this evangelical kind of upbringing and church experience, like is so very different, because once everyone's welcome, that kind of changes the whole like game. And I think those are, so looking at leadership structures and looking at inclusion, I think that's something that the church like really needs to kind of commit to wholesale if there's going to be, you know, a change in a church that we're not tired of.
Of course. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful thing that actually, one of the things I'm always mindful of is that when I'm present in spaces, particularly being in the City of London where there are not many other Black clergy, there's one other full-time Black colleague. It's a very white space being in the City of London. Within the Diocese of London, it's kind of very different to anywhere else I've been. But when I'm present in the room, I'm immediately mindful of who else isn't there, not just on the grounds of race or on the grounds of sexuality, but particularly of gender and differently abled people and class. You're aware of all of it. And so you're able to kind of challenge all of that because of the position that your own body takes up within that space. And I think that's one of the benefits of a more diverse leadership, is that it will make the church healthier, because all of those different people will hopefully be mindful of who else is not in the room. And part of the problems is, you know, we just don't have that in the leadership of the church at the moment. And it's not that the people are not there, but it's that they're not often being encouraged or nurtured to be able to take on those positions of leadership, or don't want to, because by the time they could do, they're so badly bruised and wounded by the marginalization they already experienced that they won't do it. You know, but it is important. Alexandra, do you want to unmute?
Oh, thank you. In response to your final question, I guess there's two things that come to mind. The first, I can't remember who said the quote, that the mark of a colonized body is a body that lacks imagination. So I guess in that reimagining of what a church could be, it would be a place where we can reimagine new possibilities, new worlds, and no worlds at all. And a friend was telling me about this interview of this African-American woman who was asked, what is your dream job? And she said, yeah, everything that my ancestors went through and everything that I've gone through to get to where I am, I don't dream of work, I dream of rest. So I guess for Black queer folks in particular, the church would be a place where they can live, love, and move freely. So yeah, I guess that would be my response to your question.
That's really powerful. Yeah, no, that's I can connect with that too. I think there's something really powerful about just imagining or dreaming about the kind of world or church we would want to inhabit. And there are days when I can't do that dreaming and that imagining, but when I hear about that sense of rest and safety, I think that's when I think, yeah, that's what I kind of long for on a deep level within myself. Also, thank you. Ruth?
Yeah, Alexandra, that's it's sounds so tiring, and it's so slow. And I'm thinking, I as a student, I ran an Alpha course just before the year 2000, and a lovely girl from California became a Christian, and she went back to America, and she just didn't join a church for ages because she was saying, me and my boyfriend, we want to join a gay affirming church. And I confess I didn't get it 21 years ago. I was thinking, is it that important? And it wasn't something that was on my radar here in the UK, and it was very much in the Californian scene. And she did find one, but she had to really sort of put her foot down and hold to her principles. And I've had such a gradual journey. And if I go back even before that, in the late 90s, I went to uni thinking, oh, should women be vicars? I'm not sure. And if you're homegrown in an evangelical type church, I mean, I had I had Catholic and Protestant people in my family as well. You question and you do have to reconstruct after deconstructing. And I lead the kids' work at my church. I don't want those children to have to do that. I want to construct it the right way from the start for them. So that's why it's taking time. You want to grow people who don't have to go through all of that gubbins. And I think we're going to need leaders from outside who come in already with that heart of love and inclusion, and I don't have the baggage of 20 years of being told that certain people can't do things and all this awful gatekeeping.
The one thing we haven't spoken about, and there's not really time today, but is the way in which our spirituality shapes our politics as well as our identity, you know. And one of the things I find, the number one reason why a lot of Black queer folk tell me they leave church spaces is because they suddenly discover that their radical politics can't find a place. And that's something we haven't been able to talk about, but it is a really interesting thing that some inclusive church spaces are not able to accommodate any kind of radical Black politics. And I've struggled with that for myself, particularly within the Church of England. But I know that that's something that is huge. And it's very difficult, I think, to be Black and queer and not have a radical politics, because they're necessary for survival, you know. Which is not to say that everyone who's Black and queer is politically radical, but they do sometimes go hand in hand for obvious reasons. I realise that it is 12, isn't it? Yep. So.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as much as I don't want to take up more of your time, we could literally just sit here and chat all day and everyone would love it. But yeah, I don't want to monopolize any more of the time. So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say or to just finish up or round off, Jarel.
I would just say that to touch on what Danielle was saying, that we can only love people to the extent that we know we're loved, you know, and that if we can find space within our lives to cultivate that in us. I think at the moment, the one thing that is going to get us through this time, which is still very difficult, is having an interior life, which is quite robust and quite solid. And we need the resources to pull on, I think, to get through this next phase. And I think we're at a time of so much transition and change. And the only thing that will enable us to make it is, I think, holding on to each other. And we can only do that if we know that we're held on to by God. So we need to just be aware of that, I think, and to recognize how much we do need each other in this next chapter. You know, people talk about a post-pandemic world. I don't know if we're there yet, but whatever the next thing is, we will need each other, and need to know that God has got us, and we can only know that if we focus on our interior lives. So that's a word to myself as much as anything else. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone who's engaged today and for being here and for what people have said. It's a real honor to be able to share work in this way, and writing it was lovely, but it's a greater gift to talk to people about it. So thank you. No, thank you. And we'll give a little thank you to Jarel, and yeah, it has just been such a fantastic conversation. The way that we normally finish off these kind of things, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to invite you to get back to us on email or comment on Facebook or whatever it is, but we always want to know both like what are you taking away from this, what next steps are you going to take, what have you learned, and also what can we do better when we host events like this. So, you know, what would have made today better for you in anything from the uber practical to just whatever it is that you feel like would add to your experience. So yeah, thank you again, Jarel, for sharing everything that you have. It's been such a fantastic morning, and yeah, we just hope you'll come back and do it again. Bless you. Very lovely to be with you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. All right, you can go enjoy the rest of your Saturdays.